Why South Africa was banned in AFCON. Football has been played in what is now South Africa since the mid-1800s. 1862 was the first documented football matches in South Africa and are played in Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, between white civil servants and white soldiers. In 1953, South Africa won representation on the FIFA Executive Committee, and along with Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan, formed the Confederation of African Football, CAF, in 1956. In February 1957, the first Africa Cup of Nations was held in Khartoum, Sudan. There was no qualification for this tournament, the field being made up of the four founding nations of CAF: Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, then South Africa. However, when the Confederation planned its first Cup of Nations in 1957, South Africa realized that due to apartheid, they could only send an all-black or all-white team to the tournament. South Africa's insistence on selecting only white players for its squad due to its apartheid policy led to its disqualification. The rest of CAF rejected that decision and expelled South Africa from the first African Cup of Nations. Let me explain what is apartheid or racism. Apartheid was the system that institutionalized segregation between whites and blacks in South Africa from the late 1940s until the early 1990s. The minority white citizens of the country were placed in the highest class of status, while blacks were placed at the bottom of the status system. Blacks were economically, politically, then socially excluded from most aspects of South African society, and that included sports. While soccer was considered the sport for black South Africans, the country prohibited mixed teams from representing their country as a national team. They opted instead to promote their all-white soccer federation and teams. As far as soccer was concerned, it was implemented initially with a disastrous multinational policy. This meant that teams of ethnic groupings could play against each other, but the teams and spectators were still racially segregated. White teams played against black teams and the fans were divided similarly into white and black sections. It created what was in effect a race war environment, and ugly incidents abounded in and around the perimeters of stadiums. Now let's go back to the story. In 1958, South Africa was expelled from CAF, but that same year the White Federation of South Africa was admitted to FIFA. For the first time, on March 16, 1976 to be exact, the nationalist government permitted a multiracial sports team based on merit alone to represent South Africa. However, in 1960 they were given an ultimatum: end discrimination with their national teams or risk suspension. It was not done, with then the FA president Sir Stanley Rouse saying they would not end the apartheid policies that governed their federation. FIFA officially suspended South Africa in 1961. That suspension was lifted temporarily in 1963, but was then reinstated by the FIFA Congress in 1964. At that point, the federation was essentially discontinued, but technically remained open for business. For the first time, on March 16, 1976 to be exact, the nationalist government permitted a multiracial sports team based on merit alone to represent South Africa. The 14-man football squad on that historic night in a capacity-filled Rand Stadium, with the local team labeled Springboks and not Bafana Bafana, contained 7 white footballers and 7 black, and outplayed an Argentinian selection 5-0, with the notable contribution of 4 goals from boy wonder Jomo Sono. Until FIFA expelled South Africa from its organization in 1976 after the brutal deaths in the Soweto uprising. For the next 15 years, South Africa didn't have a national team and didn't have a federation. The demonizing policies of apartheid ruled the country. Until the system began to be torn down in 1990. In 1991, a new federation was created, where all races were represented and allowed to play on their national teams. After essentially 30 years of suspension and 15 years of expulsion, South Africa was welcomed back into FIFA's membership. After that, South Africa was eligible to qualify for World Cups and play in African Cups of Nations. While they didn't qualify for the 1994 World Cup or Africa Cup of Nations, they had a big opportunity to show off their new team to the continent when they were selected to replace Kenya as the hosts of the 1996 Africa Cup of Nations. They would announce their return in a big way. The tournament was first to be expanded to 16 teams, though Nigeria's withdrawal from the tournament reduced that number to 15. Still, South Africa wanted to show that they were back on the world stage. Drawn into a group with Egypt, powerhouse Cameroon, and Angola, things weren't looking up for Bafana. They came out the gates in a big way, smashing Cameroon 3-0 in the opening match. They followed that up with a 1-0 win over Angola. Even with a 1-0 loss to Egypt in the final match of the group stage, a 3-3 draw between Angola and Cameroon meant that South Africa would advance as the group winners to the knockout stage. As they participated for the first time as host of 1996 edition, South Africa has soon established itself as an emerging African power. The first edition South Africa participated was a complete success, with the team conquered their first and only African trophy on their debut. South Africa's racially mixed team seemed to symbolize football's power to bridge the gaping social and economic inequalities left by apartheid.